Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel on Mirz Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Tzadik Daled Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today 3 lines off the bottom of Tzadik Daled Amud Aleph, Siman Shin Daled, or Daled Shin, as the Mechaber has it listed, Sif Beis. We are continuing to learn this very interesting sugya of Eved Kanani and how we deal with Avodim Kananim on Shabbos. Of course, this was Negeya back in the day when we actually had Avodim Kananim. Nowadays, we don't have Avodim Kananim. Having said that, this is a chelik of Torah Kedosha, and we must learn it, and we must understand it. So we're continuing to learn this sugya. Let's just remind ourselves that there are 2 different isurim that could pertain to the question of an Eved Kanani doing malacha on Shabbos. We have one pasuk, the pasuk of Laman Yanuach Avdecha va'amascha kamaycha. That's a pasuk from the Aseret Hadibris, Parshas Vayeschanan, that gives us an Issa Daraisa when somebody owns an Eved Kanani, and that Eved Kanani is Taval Umal, if he's Taval in a mikveh and he has a bris milah and he's bekabel on himself the mitzvahs that an Eved Kanani is chayiv in, which would be all the mitzvahs lois aseh of the Torah, and all of the mitzvahs aseh, with the exception of those that are mitzvahs aseh shazman grama. So an Eved Kanani who's makabel the mitzvahs of an Eved Kanani rises to the same level of Torah observance as a Yiddish woman. So such an Eved Kanani, there's an Issa Daraisa, he's not allowed to do malacha, and his adain, his master, has a chiyuv daraisa to prevent him from doing malacha on Shabbos. Laman yanuach avdecha va'amascha kamaycha. Then we've learned that there's a second level on Eved Kanani, a lower level, an Eved Kanani who we have referred to as the Eved Kanani Ger Toshav. That's the Eved Kanani who does not agree to accept upon himself that level of Torah observance. He's not Taval Umal L'Shem Avdus, but he is agreeable to accepting upon himself Shmiras Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. Such an Eved, there's also an Issa Daraisa for a Yid to have him do malacha on their behalf on Shabbos. That comes from a different pasuk, V'yinafesh ben amasacha v'hager. So this Eved Ger Toshav, he's allowed to do malacha for himself. He doesn't have any Shmiras Shabbos incumbent upon himself. However, a Yid, the Adain, and all other Yidden are not allowed to have him do malacha on their behalf. Now, this is not the Issa D'Rabbanan that we learned about in the beginning of Chelik Gimel, the Issa D'Rabbanan of Amir La'akum, where a Yid is not allowed to ask an Ein Yehudi to do malacha for him on Shabbos. That's an Issa D'Rabbanan that applies to all Einam Yehudim. V'yanafesh ben amasacha v'hager is an Issa D'Araisa that pertains to an Eved Kanani. There's an Issa Daraisa on an Eved Kanani. Even the lower level Eved Kanani, who's an Eved Kanani Ger Toshav, even that Eved Kanani, there's an Issa Daraisa, a Yid is not allowed to have this Eved Kanani do malacha for him on Shabbos. Now, continuing on that theme, says the Mechaber Sif Beis, V'heicha demuter ha'eved lasois malacha la'atzmai. In the cases where we have an Eved Kanani who is allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for his own purposes. So again, let's say the Eved Kanani Ger Toshav, who was only mekabel on himself Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. So he's not a Shomer Shabbos. He wants to grill himself a steak on Shabbos. He's allowed to. He's not allowed to do malacha for his Adain. He's not allowed to do malacha for any other Yisrael. No Yisraelim are allowed to have him do malacha for them, but he could do malacha on his own. So v'heicha demuter eved lasis malacha la'atzmai, when we're dealing with a case where an Eved Kanani is allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for his own purposes, now we have an interesting shaila. What happens if the adain of the Eved Kanani, now there's one piece of hilchas avodim that we have to understand over here. Now, it's a little bit complex. I'm just going to give it to you from 30,000 feet. What is the obligation of the master of an Eved Kanani to support his Eved Kanani? Is he mechuyev to support his Eved Kanani? Is he mechuyev to give his Eved Kanani food to eat? Well, the Rambam, based on a Gemara in Gittin, the Rambam paskins that really the adain of an Eved Kanani could tell his Eved Kanani, look, buddy, you got to work for me, but you need food, Go out and beg. I am not mechuyev to give you your food. Now again, that's from 30,000 feet. If we were learning Hilchas Avadim, we would have to delve into this a little bit deeper. Depends precisely what kind of Eved, what the situation is. So again, 30,000 feet. An Eved, an Adain, is not strictly required to support his Eved Kanani. So now, what happens if an Adain refuses to support his Eved Kanani and tells his Eved Kanani, look, you need food? Okay, go out and find somebody who wants to pay you to do a job. I don't know. Go. I'm giving you some time off, so go ahead. I don't know. Do some work for somebody or knock on doors and go raise money for yourself. Now, how does that come back to us here in Siman Shin Daled or Daled Shin? So it says the Mechaber like this. Im Amar Loi Ha'adain, if the Adain says to his Eved Kanani, Sheyaseh la'atzmai, go work for yourself. Go around town, knock on doors, and find out if there's anybody who needs you to shovel their snow. Or if there's anybody who needs you to do gardening work. Go ahead. Sheyaseh la'atzmai. Go work for yourself. And if they pay you, you could take that money and go out to the deli and go buy yourself breakfast and lunch. V'yozan atzmai. Go support yourself. B'yoim HaShabbos. So the Adain is saying like this. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Okay, you're working for me. I'm giving you your breakfast, your lunch, and supper. Shabbos, you're not working for me. I can't allow you to work for me on Shabbos. Laman Yanuach. Well, no, not Laman Yanuach. That would be an Eved Kanani, Eved Kosher, who's not allowed to do malacha even for himself on Shabbos. But v'yanafesh ben amascha v'hager. You're an Eved Ger Toshav. You're allowed to work on Shabbos, but you're not allowed to work for me on Shabbos. So you know what? On Shabbos, go ahead, find landscaping work to do on Shabbos, and support yourself on Shabbos. Go do your own work for other people, get paid, and buy your own breakfast, lunch, and supper for Shabbos. Leave me out of it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So again, says the Mechaber, in this case, when we're talking about, let's say, an Eved Ger Toshav who's allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for his own purposes, if his master says to him, that on Shabbos he should work for himself, he should earn his own money and he should support himself on Shabbos, says the Mechaber, if he makes this deal with the Eved when it's still Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos begins, then the Eved could go ahead, work for himself, and support himself. Now, remember, this Eved is always allowed to do malacha for his own purposes on Shabbos. The Chiddush of the Mechaber over here is, in this case, in a sense, you might look at it and say that the Eved is actually working on Shabbos for the purposes of the Adain. Why? Because what's happening over here is the Adain is telling the Eved, I don't want to have to support you on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, go ahead and work, aka do malacha. On Shabbos, go ahead and work and support yourself. So there's a certain angle over here where you might look at it and you might say, is the Eved working for himself? Is he working for his own breakfast, lunch, and supper? Or is there also an angle here where he's working for the Adain? Because he's working to raise his own money for breakfast, lunch, and supper, and now the Adain is not going to supply him with breakfast, lunch, and supper. So by the Eved working, right, he's taking off the need for the Adain to supply him with breakfast, lunch, and supper. So is there an angle here where he's working for the Adain? Says the Mechaber, no. As long as the deal is made before Shabbos, this is okay. So it's Erev Shabbos, and the Adain tells the Eved, Shabbos is coming. Go off on your own. Work for yourself. Support yourself. That's fine, says the Mechaber. Now, of course, the direct implication over here is that you're not allowed to make this deal on Shabbos. And we'll have to understand why you're not allowed to make this deal on Shabbos. But first, the Mechaber throws in another caveat here. And that is, first of all, ubelvad bitzina. But when the Eved goes to work for himself, it has to be bitzina. It has to be discreetly. Why? Shelo yehei b'davar chash royim. So that there shouldn't be a maris ayin problem. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah back at Tzadik Daled Amud Aleph, Mishnah Berurah is Chaf Aleph. Amar leya adayin, if the adayin says to the eved, she'em yirtzeh, so the first thing you have to understand is what I told you from the Rambam. She'em yirtzeh shaloi l'zaynoi v'sheyachzer eved al apsachim harishus b'yadoi. What you have to understand is, the adayin is not strictly speaking obligated to support the eved. You see, if the adayin was chayiv to support the eved, then you would have a real problem. Then when the eved goes to work for himself, he is working for the adayin, right? The adayin has a chayiv to give the adayin money for breakfast, lunch, and supper. He's telling the eved, you go work and earn that money. Well, in that case, the eved is going and earning money that the adayin is really chayiv to give him. So then who's he working for? He's working for the adayin. So that would be a real problem. Then this would be aser. I don't care if you made the deal on Shabbos. I don't care if you made the deal on Erev Shabbos. The eved is actually working for the adayin in that case. But says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not the halacha. The halacha is that an adayin is not, strictly speaking, mechuyev to pay for the support of his eved Kanani. Therefore, when the eved goes out to work to get his own food, he's not working for the adayin. He's working for himself. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kain Oisa Eved Latzmai. So it comes out that in reality, the eved is working for himself, not for the adayin. Having said that, the Mechaber said, so if you would pause right now, you would be tempted to say that what's the explanation of this halacha? Very simple, just like the Mishnah Berurah just said. When an eved goes out to work for his own food, he's not working for the adayin. The adayin's not mechuyev to give him food. So when the eved works for his own food, he's working for himself. So yeah, he can go work for himself on Shabbos. The same way he's allowed to go grill a steak on Shabbos, because he's not mechuyev in Shmir Shabbos, he's also allowed to go work to get money to buy the steak. That's also for his own purposes. So what's the chiddush here? The chiddush is, like the Mechaber says, this is only mutter if the deal was made before Shabbos. But if the deal were to be made on Shabbos, it would be aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is only mutter if the deal was made before Shabbos. Shabbos to aser. But to make this deal on Shabbos would be aser. Now the Mishnah Berurah doesn't explain why. It would seem that the reason why is because if they went into Shabbos on the assumption that the adayin is going to give food to the eved, like he always does, if that was the assumption going into Shabbos, then if on Shabbos the adayin turns to the eved and says, you know what, things are a little tight right now, go work for your own money. Now it looks like the eved is working for the adayin. In reality, he's not working for the adayin. In reality, he's working for himself, because the adayin is never mechuyev to support him. So in reality, he's working for himself, but the optics are no good. The optics now become, it looks like he's working for the adayin. And therefore, says the Mechaber, to do it on Shabbos would be aser. There are others who want to suggest that there's even a bigger problem, and that is there's an iser on Shabbos of mimtzoi cheftzecha. You're not allowed to conduct business on Shabbos. To make this deal on Shabbos with the eved, tell the eved, I was going to give you food, right? But I'm not. So go out and do it yourself. That at least schmecks of mimtzai cheftzecha. But in any case, that's what seems to be going on here. Continues the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chav Beis. V'em loy amar le klal. Let's say the adayin doesn't say a word to the eved. Never comes up for discussion. Eloha eved oisa me'atzmai v'roitza lizay mimenu. But the eved Kanani, just of his own volition, picks himself up on Shabbos and finds work to do to keep the money, to buy some food. Hevi be'el Rabba b'shem sefer minchas kayin de mutter. The El Rabba says, then it doesn't go back to the adayin. If the eved does it of his own volition, it's fine. What does this have to do with the adayin? The adayin didn't tell him to do it. However, the Levushei Srad says we should not be makel. So the Adain told the Eved, Oisahu Litzarchem is Ainaisab. The Eved should go out and work. He's allowed to go out and work for his own food. Ritzayna Loimar, when the Mechaber says that if you make this deal before Shabbos, the Eved is allowed to go out and work for his own money, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzayna Loimar, Afilu Beveis Rabbi. He's even allowed to work in the Adain's home. Kevin Chu Betzina. As long as it's betzina, it's not public, it's discreetly, nobody's seeing it. Uchid Messiah, like we said, it has to be betzina. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Yehudi. Certainly, if the Adain if the Eved wants to go out and work for another Eino Yehudi, so it's Shabbos, and now this Eved, who's an Eved Ger Toshav, he's not Mechuyev Shmir Shabbos, he has a job to do for Tony, to work in Tony's house, the Eino Yehudi, on Shabbos, gesund to hate. Yisrael acher afilu betzina. But this Eved Ger Toshav is not allowed to go work for another Yid on Shabbos, even if he does that work betzina, Eved Yisraelu, because this Eved is an Eved Ger Toshav that belongs to a Yid. We learned earlier in the Siman, an Eved Ger Toshav belongs to a Yid. He's not allowed to do malacha for any Yid on Shabbos. It doesn't matter if it's betzina or it's parabim. He's not allowed to do malacha for a Yid. So again, the halacha that we have over here is, you have this Eved Kenani Ger Toshav. He personally has no chiyuv of Shmir Shabbos. He personally is always allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for his own purposes. The shaila that we cleared over here is that the Adain doesn't want to have to support his Eved Kenani on Shabbos. He doesn't want to have to pay for his food or give him food on Shabbos. So he tells him, go ahead, work for yourself on Shabbos. Okay, says the Mechaber, he's allowed to go work for himself, and we don't put that back on the Adain. As long as they made the deal on Erev Shabbos, the Adain is allowed to allow the Eved Ger Toshav to go ahead and go do work for himself on Shabbos. We don't look at it that he's working for the Adain. Why? First of all, factually, he's not working for the Adain, because the Adain's not mechuyev to give him anything. So he's not working for the Adain, and as long as the deal was made before Shabbos, the optics are okay, and therefore it is permissible. Therefore it's allowable. Says the Mechaber, however, the work has to be done betzina. It has to be discreet. So if the Eved Kenani is working indoors, in the Adain's house, he's not working for the Adain. He's not doing his Adain's work. He's doing his own work. He's stuffing envelopes for somebody in the house. He's not doing it for a Yid. He's doing it for a guy. That's fine. Then the Mishnah Berurah said, certainly, if the Eved Kenani wants to go do work for an Eino Yehudi on Shabbos, gesund to hate. Now, there's an interesting Sharetzion over here. Sharetzion Ois Kot Yud Ches declares an interesting shaila. Says the Chavetz Chaim in Ois Kot Yud Ches in the Sharetzion, V'yesh la'ayin. However, we have to look into im sham gam kein tzrichim sheyehei betzina. Let's say the Eved Kenani gets a job to work for Tony the Eino Yehudi on Shabbos. What does Tony the Eino Yehudi want him to do? Landscaping work. Well, landscaping work is not betzina. Landscaping work is outdoors, right? He's going to be using a loud lawnmower and one of those obnoxious, really loud leaf blowers outside on Shabbos. That's not betzina. So now you have an Evet Kenani Ger Toshav who belongs to a Yid doing work for another Eino Yehudi. He's not working for his Adain. He's working for Eino Yehudi, for Tony, on Shabbos. Does that work have to be betzina? I understand that if he's working in his Adain's house, then the work that he's doing has to be discreet. It has to be betzina. Why? Because if it won't be betzina, yizberu shuhu meleches rabbi. People who see the Evet Kenani working in his Adain's house on Shabbos might assume that he's working for the Adain. That's also that's in a Daraisa. But if he's doing landscaping work at Tony's house, why does it have to be betzina? Why is anybody going to think that he's working for his Adain? They see he's working for Tony. On the other hand, says the Chavetz Chaim, the efsher de gambazet tzartzina. But maybe this also has to be betzina. You know why? You know what people might think? People might think that the Yisrael who owns the Evet Kanani realizes, I can't have the Evet Kanani do malacha for me on Shabbos, but my Evet Kanani could do malacha for Tony on Shabbos. So you know what I'll do? I'll rent out my Evet Kanani to Tony for Shabbos. And that's a problem. Because then the Evet Kanani is doing work for the Adain. He's doing work by Tony so that the Adain should get paid by Tony. So that would be Aser. So maybe, therefore, even if the Evet Kanani is going to do landscaping work by Tony, he can't do that outside. He could do plumbing work inside Tony's house, but he can't do landscaping work outside Tony's house. Okay, turning the page to Tzadik Daled Amid Beis, moving along to the final sif in this Siman, Sif Gimel, says the Bechaber. Ein Yehudi Gomor, an absolute bona fide Ein Yehudi, Shehu Sachir, who's an employee. He's not an Evet Kanani, he's an employee. Like the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, even if he's a very long-term employee. Somebody made a contract with an Ein Yehudi, he hired him for 10 years. So he's a long-term employee, but he's not an Evet Kanani. The Yid doesn't have a Kinyan Aguf. He doesn't own him, so he's an employee. Says the Bechaber, Ein Yehudi Gamu Shu Sachir, Ein Rabbi Mitzvah Al Shvisasai, V'yinafesh ben Amascha v'ager l'man yinuach avdecha v'amascha kamoicha. These psukim don't apply to employees. They apply to Avanim Kedanim. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kol Chav Daled Ein Yehudi Gomor. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Avalim Kibel Olav Hasheva Mitzvahs. But let's say you have an Ein Yehudi who's taken not an Eved. He's not owned by the Yisrael. He's an employee. Yitaka made a contract with him for 10 years. But this Ein Yehudi has learned a lot of valuable lessons while living in this Yid's house, and he decides that he wants to be a goy kosher. What does that mean? He wants to keep the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Avalin kibel olav Sheva Mitzvahs. If this Ein Yehudi Gomor is mekabel on himself to keep Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, halayhu ger toshav. Well, now he's actually a ger toshav. Now again, ger toshav is the Ein Yehudi who we allowed to live together with us in Eretz Yisrael when we're living in Eretz Yisrael with a Malchus Yisrael and everything else. Not everybody could just come live in Eretz Yisrael. Mashiach will come, Mirz Hashem, today, and we're living in Eretz Yisrael. We have a Malchus Yisrael. An Ein Yehudi comes and says, I want to live in Tel Aviv. Well, you're an Ein Yehudi and you want to live in Eretz Yisrael. If you're a goy kosher, if you're keeping Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, then we're allowed to let you live in Eretz Yisrael. So, if you have this Ein Yehudi who comes along and says, I want to be a ger toshav, I'm going to keep Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, then guess what? Forget Eved. This guy's not an Eved. The pasuk of Yinafesh ben Amascha v'hager applies to this person. You know why? Because the Isser Daraisa that we have been speaking about from the pasuk of Yinafesh ben Amascha v'hager comes from the words V'yinafesh ben Amascha. That's what we have been focusing on until now. We're talking about an Eved, ben Amascha, the son of your maidservant, aka an Eved. So V'yinafesh ben Amascha says that if a Yid owns an Eved, so then there's an Isser Daraisa. The Eved is not allowed to do malach on behalf of a Yisrael. But there's another word in that pasuk. V'yinafesh ben Amascha v'hager. The Gemara in Yevamah says, who is that referring to? Who is that ger in that pasuk? Not a ger tzedek. A ger tzedek, a bona fide ger, a convert, who accepts taryag mitzvahs upon himself, goes to the mikveh, everything else. A regular ger, of course he's mechuyev in Shabbos. So V'yinavesh ben Amascha v'ager, that word ger is not talking about a ger tzedek. That word ger is talking about a ger toshav. That means that there's an Isser Daraisa for any Yid to have a ger toshav do malacha for him on Shabbos. So cautions the Mishnah Berurah, he cautions us over here. When the Bechaber says that an Ein Yehudi Gomor doesn't fall under the rubric of Evet Kanani, and therefore there's no mitzvah al shvisasai, we're not mechuyev to make sure he keeps Shabbos, says the Mishnah Berurah, but hold it. If he's a ger toshav, then we are mitzvah al shvisasai. From v'yunafesh ben amascha v'hager. Says the Mishnah Berurah inside. Avalim kibel olav sheva mitzvahs. If an Eini Yehudi Gomer accepts upon himself sheva mitzvah b'nei noyach, halayhu ger toishav. So now he's a ger toishav. V'asalasis malacha li Yisrael af l'mi she'ena rabbi. And he's not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos for another yid, even if that yid is not his adoin. Nobody is his adoin. He's not an evet. The chanal, like we learned earlier in Sif Aleph, v'yinafesh ben amascha v'hager. He means Sif Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah, not Sif Aleph in the Mechaber. V'ayin b'Rambam Perek Yudal Mehilchos Yisrei Biyah. Take a look at the Rambam, who says, De'ein mekablin ger toishav bizman she'ein hayovel noyeg. Rabbi said there is no din of a ger toishav nowadays, because ger toishav only applied when we had yovel. V'chein evet she'ein haroitza lekabel of mitzvahs ki im sheva k'may ger toishav. So too, the lower level evet kanani that we have been discussing, the evet kanani ger toishav, such a concept doesn't exist. Gam kein en mekabel noisai bizman she'ein hayovel noyeg. When we don't have yovel, we don't have the evet kanani ger toishav. V'arayvet sham chelek al zeh ayin sham. Ois kan chav hey. This Mechaber was talking here in Sif Gimel about an Eini Yehudi Gomer shehu sachir, who is an employee. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this applies afilu him sachir lekama shonim. When we're talking about this Eini Yehudi Gomer who is an employee, it means even if he's a very long-term employee, he's contracted for many years. But he might be a very long-term employee, but there's no ownership involved here. The Adon doesn't own him with the Kinyan Aguf. Therefore, and therefore, this Eini Yehudi, who is a long-term employee, even if the Adon comes to him and instructs him to do malacha, that's not an Issa Daraisa. This is a typical guy. So the Isser to tell a guy to do malacha for you on Shabbos is an Issa Darabanan. Amir Lakum. There's no Issa Daraisa. He's not included in either the pasuk of Laman Yenuach Avdecha V'Amascha Kamaycha or V'Yinafesh Ben Amascha V'Ager. He's not your Eved. He's not your Ben Amascha. He's not a Ger. Go back to the beginning of Chelik Gimel. Any kind of malacha that's mutter to ask an Eini Yehudi to do would be mutter for this fellow. So we've learned, let's say, by Amir La'akum, if you have a chayla she'ein by sakana and you need somebody to make a tea for him on Shabbos, you could ask an Eini Yehudi to boil up water for the chayla she'ein by sakana. So too over here. This guy is a long-term employee. He's a retainer of your family, but he's not an eved. You could go ahead and you could ask him to boil up water for a chayla she'ein by sakana. The Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef writes an interesting thing. Shamari Abuav nistapik ba'isa no havadim v'hashvachais oivdei gelulim shem ratzu lahamar dasam likanis ladas Yishmael yotzim lecheres. Apparently, in the days of the Mahari Abuav, there was an interesting mitzias. You had Christian avodim. So these were avodim. These were avodim kananim. They were owned by their adon. So the halachas that we've learned here in Siman Shin Daled applied to these avodim. But the Malchus, the government, had a very interesting halacha. And that was, it was an Arab government. It was a government of Muslims, Yishmaelim. And they had an interesting law. They wanted to entice people to leave Christianity and become Muslims. So what they did was, they said to all avodim, you're an Eved, guess what? If you convert from Christianity to Islam, we're going to grant you your freedom. So that means that any person who was an Adon that was owned by Yisrael, there was an out clause in their Avdos. Any day that they wanted to, they could cast off their Christianity and they could take on Islam, and then they would go free. So they all had an out clause in their Avdos to the Yid. So now the shaila becomes, does that mean that they're not bona fide avodim? Does that out clause in their avdus lessen the degree to which they're considered avodim, that they're considered owned by the Yisrael? So that was the suffix that the Mari Abuav had. The Kazab Beis Yosef they says it writes, the Mari Abuav this topic. The Mari Abuav had a suffix. When you had avodim and shvachos, that were worshiping Avodah Zarah. And the government said, if they would give up their religious beliefs, and they would become Muslims, they would go out to freedom. After it's possible, it's possible that even though they are owned as avodim by Yidden, maybe this out clause gives them the status of a long-term employee as opposed to the status of a real Eved Kanani, because they have an out clause that they can exercise whenever they want. The Achrayim take the position that we should be machmir, it's a Torah, because remember, we're dealing here with the Surah Daraisa, right? Certainly, in a country where this law doesn't exist, by a long-term employee, the employer of this long-term employee has no mitzvah of shvisas avdoi. Yorum hoidoi. Very careful the Chavetz Chaim was with kavod hamalchus. The lashon of Chavetz Chaim here is b'makom shamelech, in a place, a region where the king Yorum hoidoi, his glory should be exalted. Gazar she'ein shum adam chutz midasam yichaylim liknois eved va'ama. There were countries where the decree of the malchus was that only somebody who took on the religious beliefs of the country was entitled to own an Eved or an Amma. So if you lived in a Christian country, if you were a good Christian, you could go ahead, you could own an Eved v'Amma. But if you were a Jew or a Muslim, you couldn't own an Eved or an Amma. So says the Mishnah Berurah, in such a country, ha'avadim v'ashvachos yichaylim lahaver eish b'Shabbos. The avadim could go make fires on Shabbos. David gischir b'alma, because all they are is employees. They're not allowed to own an Eved, so he's not an Eved. But there are those that disagree, who they hold that no, this governmental law does not mean that they're not owned by the Yid. They are owned by the Yid. If the fact is that the Yid bought them, so the Yid does own them. Yeah, there's such a law on the books, but so what? The Akshav nowadays, says the Chavetz Chaim, I guess in the days of the Chavetz Chaim, there still was a concept of owning an Eved, but like all good governments all over the place, they look to tax everything that they could possibly tax. So if you owned Avadim, you had to pay a tax for your Eved. So says the Mishnah Berurah, can't have it both ways. If the government is levying a tax on us for owning the Eved, so then l'kuli alma gafet kanav asurim b'malacha. If the government is taxing me for owning the Eved, then obviously I own the Eved. And if I own the Eved, then he can't do malacha for me. But this also generates a kula. What's the kula? We know that a mamzer, right, the offspring of an illicit incestuous union, is not allowed to marry a Yisraelis kashera, a kosher Yiddish woman. But a mamzer is allowed to marry a shifcha kenanis. So the kula that's generated over here, says the Chavetz Chaim, is if the government is charging a tax for a shivcha, then the shivcha is a bona fide shivcha kenanis. If the shivcha is a bona fide shivcha kenanis, and this would be a shivcha kenanis, a shivcha kishera, a shivcha that's makabel mitzvahs, so then a yid who's a mamzer would be allowed to marry that shivcha, and similarly the eved mamzeres, similarly the eved kosher would be allowed to marry, or the mamzeres would be allowed to marry an eved kosher. That brings us to the conclusion of this interesting Siman, Siman Shin Daled Shin. Now we move along to Siman Shin Hey, as we march our way, Baruch Hashem, through Hilchos Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, Bameh Behema Yotzes B'Shabbos, what kind of burdens are animals allowed to go out to Rishus HaRabim bearing on Shabbos? So Boichav Gimel Seifim, and here we will have 23 Seifim. Now I just want to give a kind of a, in the interest of full disclosure at the beginning of this Siman, that this Siman is going to be Negela Maisa to people who have pets or keep various types of animals on Shabbos. We'll work our way through the Siman and we'll infer what we could infer. Having said that, I am not the owner of a pet. I'm not the owner of animals. These are not halachas that I have delved deeply into, and I will say that we should learn it so that we understand what's a shaila, what's not a shaila. If you are the owner of a pet and you have a particular shaila halacha lamaisa, I would urge you to go ask your Rav for a psak on your particular case. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. We know, we've learned already quite a bit, that when it comes to a person going out on Shabbos to Rishus Harabim, so there's that very high level golden rule that we've learned, which is a person is allowed to go out with something that's a malbush. What's a malbush? A garment, something that protects or conceals the body. Person is allowed to go out with a takshit. What's a takshit? Something that adorns the body, or we've spoken about functional takshitim. Something which is not quite a garment. It doesn't really, so to speak, protect or conceal the body, but it definitely serves the body like the cane for a person who's incapable of walking without a cane. So that cane becomes a malbush. It's a takshit. We call it a takshit. But it's the functional, it's a very high level takshit. It's a takshit that really has the din of a malbush. So we're going to see over here that these kind of apply to a behema as well. Now, of course, the given over here is that a yid has a chiv of shvisas behemtoi. Your animal is not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. You have to prevent your animal from doing malacha. Having said that, it's not all malacha. For example, are you allowed to let your cow eat on Shabbos? Yes. Could he eat grass? Yes. Even though he's uprooting grass, oy vey, he's doing a malacha. Kaitzer, he's being toilish grass on Shabbos. Doesn't matter. That eating that the cow is doing is totally for its own purposes. It's hungry, it wants to eat. You're allowed to allow it to eat. But to do malacha for you, so to speak, you're not allowed to have your malacha, your animal do malacha. If the animal's carrying something that you put on the animal's not doing it for its own purposes. But having said that, there are certain types of items that the animal is allowed to wear out in Rishus Harabim on Shabbos, because those items are like malbushim or takshitim for the animal, and therefore they're bottled to the guf of the animal. We don't look at it as a masui. We don't look at it that the animal's carrying a burden. We look at it that this is something that the animal needs, and it becomes bottled to the guf of the animal. It becomes part and parcel, so to speak, of the body of the animal. So based on that, says the Mechaber as follows. Behema Yotzeis, an animal is allowed to go out to Rishus Harabim, with items that protect or guard the animal. But if it's something that's not serving that kind of purpose, us having it to rusa yiserasa b'yoser, if it's something that is way excessive in the guarding or the protecting of the animal, and we'll see examples of this, then hevim asui. Then it's a burden and it's not allowed to go out. V'chein similarly, kol davar shu l'noi v'loi l'shimur. Similarly, anything high level, anything that's only there to adorn the animal, to prettify the animal, v'loy l'shimur, but doesn't protect or guard the animal, loy seitzei boy. The animal's not allowed to go out. So again, very high level right now. What the Mechaber is saying is, the same way a person's allowed to go out with a malbush, a functional takshit, on Shabbos, and it's not a problem of haitzah, so too the animal is allowed to go out with items that the animal needs for its protection, for its shmira. It's allowed to go out. But to beautify the animal, no. That is no Indian. That the animal is allowed to go out with it. Also, if you have something that might serve the purpose of protecting the animal, but it's very excessive, this kind of animal does not need that, then it's too excessive and it becomes a masui, and it's awesome. And now the Mechaber gives cases. Hilkach, therefore, Naka, a Naka, the Mishnah Berurah says, is a white or light-colored female camel. which apparently is an animal that requires a lot of shmira. It's a very strong animal. So hilkach naka yoitzeis bizmama de parzala is allowed to go out with an iron nose ring. A white female camel is a very strong, powerful animal. It needs very strong protection. So they would pierce the nose and put in an iron ring and attach a chain. Okay, the animal's allowed to go out with that because that's necessary for the guarding and the protection of the animal. It's bottled to the animal. It's like a malbush of the animal, and that's mutter. What is, again, this Zmama de Parzala? Shu tabas shel barzel. It's an iron ring. The noitiv chatmai that would pierce the nose of the camel, umachdisai by, and insert it. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut out. Behema yoises. Tihinei ksiv. Laban yenuach sharcha v'kamerecha. Again, the aleph base here, the given is that a yid is mechuyev b'shvisas behemtoi. A yid is mechuyev to prevent his animal from doing malacha. Harei his hirat Torah behemes Yisrael tenuach b'Shabbos. So a yid is a chiyuv to make sure that his animal does not do malacha on Shabbos. V'lav davka behema. Now this is not only an animal, meaning a cow, a dog, who adin oifos v'chol balakayim, even birds, or other types of livestock, other live animals. There's an Isser, you're not allowed to let them do malacha. V'lachein, therefore, davka kisheteitze b'davar shu la l'shmira have a takshit v'orcha. It's only when the animal goes out with something that guards and protects it, then that item is considered a takshit, and it has to be orcha. It has to be normal for the animal to go out with such an item even during the week. V'arehu kamalbish l'adam. In that case, it becomes like a malbish to a person. V'lav masayu, and it's not a burden. But something that does not protect the animal, have a masui. It's a masui. So it's a burden v'aser, and then the animal's not allowed to go out with it. Because then the animal would be performing the malach of haitzah. And so too, if the animal goes out with something that would appear to be for shmira purposes, but it's way in excess of what the animal needs, so then that item is also a masui. So if your cute little puppy, if your cute little golden doodle goes out on Shabbos with an iron nose ring, a golden doodle does not need an iron nose ring. And it never goes out with an iron nose ring. So then the iron nose ring for the golden doodle is a masui. The leash is not a masui because it's normal for the golden doodle to have a leash. So the leash is not a masui, it's a malbush. But the iron nose ring would certainly be a masui, and it would be aser. Ice cut and base, the Bechaber said biyoser. It has to be an extreme, like extremely too much shmira. Dafka b'shmira yisera harbe. So the Mishnah Berurah is saying, when we say that something that is a shmira, but it's an excess, it has to be way in excess. So if you own a golden doodle, you don't have to start clearing the leash that's on the golden doodle. I don't know. Is it a lightweight leash? Is it a heavyweight leash? Maybe this leash was really designed for a German Shepherd or a Pit Bull. I don't know if my golden doodle could go out with such a leash. No. It has to be extreme. If it's extremely beyoser, that's when you have a problem. We can't be so persnickety about this. Ice cut and gimel. The Mechaber said that it's something that prettifies the animal. An animal's not allowed to go out with. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kameh b'Sif Cut and Yud Beis. In Sif Cut and Yud Beis, we're going to have some more detail to this. Ice Cut and Dalet, Hilkach. Now the Mishnah Berurah starts giving us examples. The first example that we saw was the Naka, the white female camel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Cut and Dalet, Hilkach. Nakat v'holich b'tchila habehemes hachazakos. The Bechaber starts off with very powerful animals, shetzricha shmira b'yoser, that need very heavy-duty shmira. V'loy dailahem b'shmira kala, it's not enough for them for a lightweight shmira. Going, for example, the Naka, she gamla nekeva lavana, this white female camel, shetarach l'shmirasa dafkas mama de parzala b'chatma. It requires an iron nose ring. V'loy daila b'faga de parzala. For a white female camel, an iron bit in its mouth is insufficient. It needs an iron nose ring. The choshken ba'afsar, an afsar, which is a halter. Picture the pictures that you've seen of horses that have, I think it's called a bridle, that have like the straps around its head, that's called an afsar. That's a halter. A white female camel, a halter is insufficient. An iron bit in the mouth is insufficient, and therefore va'asura lotzes b'hem. They wouldn't be allowed. It would be usher for the naka to go out with an iron bit or with a halter. You know why? Because it's not a malbush. You know why it's not a malbush? Because it's insufficient. But it could go out with an iron nose ring, because an iron nose ring is what's appropriate for it. The chamara luva, the next case that we're going to see Mir Hashem tomorrow, is going to be a Luvian donkey. The chamara luva, who chamara bama medinas luv, befagid the pazala. For the chamra luva, what's appropriate is an iron bit in the mouth. Avaloi mama, but not with an iron nose ring. That would be inappropriate. That would be an itirusa yiserasa, and apparently harbe, and therefore it would be aser. Tizehulan itirusa yisei rasa. We're going to stop over here. We'll continue with this fighter next time. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman Atayr, discuss of Liman Atayr, should be making Agas Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shem should say Yeshua's refuahs panasim sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'mherav Yomeinu Amen. Be well.